Welcome everyone back to the IRP Thursday Seminar Series. We have a great lineup this fall, and we're thrilled to be starting off with Rahim Kurwa, who is an assistant professor of law, criminology,
and justice.
Most important perhaps, at UIC. He'll be talking about some of his work on housing and welfare rights. Next week we have Augustine Detta, who will be talking about the Oregon health insurance experiment and emergency reviews. So come back for that. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rahim Kurwa. And he said he will take questions along the way. So throw up those hands and ask as many questions as you like. Hand it to you. Thanks, Rahim.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Catherine and for Dana for organizing all this. I appreciate it very much. The title of my talk today is Subsidized Housing Within a Welfare Rights Framework, and it comes from an ongoing book project on the policing of Section 8 housing choice voucher tenants. And the book project's main sort of thesis or issue of investigation is the way that policing is used to reproduce racial segregation in American society. But along the way, there are some other components of what is sort of played out in that scenario that I'm going to try to explore today. And part of my motivation or interest is that we're sort of in between two very important anniversaries in American public policy history. The first being the 30th anniversary, if you can believe it, of the beginning of the Hope 6 program, Housing Opportunities for People Everywhere. And this program sort of emerges after a period of disinvestment in American public housing that leads to disrepair. And Hope 6 essentially mandates the sort of demolition of those disrepaired units and their partial reconstruction or partial replacement over time. But it sort of marked the end of an era of American public housing as we knew it. And the other major anniversary that's coming up is the anniversary of welfare reform. And I think if I reflect on my education in sociology, and I think the sort of prevailing way American social science has understood these two programs over the years, it's that these two programs took sort of divergent pathways, that it's widely understood that welfare reform has generally been negative for the people who benefit from that program. But on the other hand, that what we did with public housing was sort of more beneficial in that it allowed people to sort of move more freely around the city, and that sort of moving could promote their socioeconomic mobility over time as well. But I think that now with the benefit of more hindsight, we have an opportunity to think about these programs together. And I think the narrative of divergence is maybe less persuasive, at least to me now, than a narrative of actual convergence. And so we can go over some of that convergence or the sort of mutually constitutive nature of these two programs by thinking about their origins, their trajectories over the last several decades, and today the way they're being regulated. Of course, when looking at their origins, even though public housing sort of predates the New Deal, the New Deal is sort of its most important era of its sort of construction and sort of legislative authority. AFDC and the 1937 Public Housing Act, are passed within just a few years of each other, and there's a lot of good scholarship that talks about the social movements that pushed for both of these things, right? And it pushed for a more broader social democratic agenda in the country. But since then, and especially through the sort of 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's also been a different trajectory that has sort of affected multiple areas of the American social safety net. And I think actually today there's a tremendous amount of really good writing and scholarship that is really looking back on that era with fresh eyes. And here I'm thinking of new work by Elizabeth Popp Berman and Lily Geismer, as well as Louis Quant, which all in different ways sort of re-examine where housing fits in the broader sort of economics-oriented or efficiency-oriented thinking that has characterized American public policy making around the social safety net. And many of these books do a really good job of putting housing into that broader story, which I think, is not how I thought of it, when I was, younger and sort of learning these concepts. And then lastly, we can think about the sort of tie together between these programs through their regulation, right? So obviously, public housing is a site where these programs overlap, right? Someone can live in public housing and also receive Medicaid, for example, right? And historically, that was very much the case with other federal programs. But also, post-civil rights era, you see a broad criminalization of the American social safety net across multiple areas of the safety net, and public housing is no exception to that trend, right? Books by Dorothy Roberts on child and family services, of course, like the groundbreaking text by Karen Gustafson, and many other follow-ups like Spencer Hedworth and others chart this in welfare, but also Kara Bridges' work in Medicaid showed basically the same patterns happening over and over again throughout different areas of social safety net policies, right? And I think that one can make the same argument for public housing and its successor programs, right? And ultimately, what happens in housing can tell us a lot about the fate and the future of the welfare rights movement or its sort of legal legacy over time, which is quite a remarkable and inspiring legacy. And so I'm going to try to explore these issues in a place that you probably have never heard of called Los Angeles County's Antelope Valley. And that's just a picture of what the sort of valley looks like. It's a sort of deserty kind of region, famous for its Joshua trees. And here it is on Google Maps, and you can see that it's in this red circle at the top of Los Angeles County. And that would put it at about an hour to an hour and a half drive, depending on traffic from like the Hollywood sign or downtown LA or UCLA or something. And to get there, you go through the Los Angeles National Forest, which you may also not have known that LA has a forest. But the Antelope Valley sort of has its origin point in the sort of World War II economy, where aerospace investment and aerospace military production really ramps up in the valley and grows a sort of economy there. And maybe some of you have heard of this movie, The Right Stuff, from the 1980s, but it sort of glamorizes what happens in the Antelope Valley as these sort of aerospace testing, what's called the space cowboy, like Chuck Yeager in this picture who breaks the sound barrier over there. This was its image, and it was a very prosperous area that sort of, was like a more perfect version of LA than LA itself, right? But this doesn't last forever. And of course, as the Cold War sort of comes to an end, so does all of that industrial investment that was pouring into the Antelope Valley and sustaining its sort of military subsidized economy, right? And so what it ends up with is a lot of housing, but very little of an economy to speak of. And over time, it sort of turns housing into its economy. And that's become its sort of function in LA County in more recent years, right? And this transformation, this economic decline and this turn to housing as its main sort of raison d'etre, you could say, has put it at the top of the charts of incarceration spending in Los Angeles. You see here in the $1 Million Hoods project that maps incarceration spending around the county that the two main cities of the Antelope Valley, Lancaster and Palmdale, routinely end up at sort of the top of these charts when it comes to overall dollars spent on incarceration, arrests per capita, and other measures as well. Meanwhile, the Antelope Valley has ended up at the bottom of the county's life expectancy rates. Life expectancy rates in the Antelope Valley are around 74 years, which is what the US has dropped to overall since the pandemic. And you can contrast that with some of the more wealthy areas of Los Angeles County that have life expectancy rates in the mid to high 80s. And finally, it's taken on this function as like a sort of housing escape valve for the county. It's among the places where LA's poorest residents are being pushed to as a result of the city's sort of economic crisis, housing crisis, even policing crisis that are going on sort of within the metropolis. And this has like very serious implications that are really the subject of like much concern amongst civil liberties and civil rights advocates in the city. Like I mentioned, it's at the bottom of the Mojave Desert, so people who are being pushed out there with very little social support are dealing with extreme heat on an almost daily basis now. And this process has also come alongside a sort of contemporary wave of black migration to the Antelope Valley, basically between 1990 and 2010. And it's basically following this trend. People are being pushed out of the Antelope Valley, pushed out of Los Angeles and find the Antelope Valley as a viable alternate destination, right? And since the 1980s, the fraction of residents of the city of Lancaster, for example, who identify as white alone on the census has dropped precipitously, while you see a very strong increase in the fraction of residents who identify as black or who identify as Latino or Hispanic, right? So it's really undergone a tremendous demographic change over time. And part of this story is housing choice vouchers. And for those of you who are sort of familiar with housing choice vouchers, you could probably intuitively understand why this would be the case. But just to explain how the program works briefly, it sort of works like a coupon, I guess you could say, to put it most simply. If you qualify for a voucher and are able to get a voucher, which is already a pretty big hurdle, your next job is to find a landlord who is willing to rent to you. And if that landlord does, then the landlord will receive a fair market rent from the local housing authority, and you will pay the housing authority a portion of your income as rent to the housing authority. But you can kind of see all the different steps along the way in which landlords can sort of choose not to sort of play this game, right? And so landlords ultimately only really end up participating in the voucher program when it's in their clear economic interest to do so. And that corresponds to where the housing market is sort of weakest, right? And so the distribution of voucher renters in Los Angeles, in the county, looks very striking in that many of them live in the sort of South Central corridor and many of them are out in the Antelope Valley, and not that much density of voucher usage anywhere else. And I should also say that the Antelope Valley is only 3% of LA County's population. So this is a very strange sort of map of LA. And it's holding today something like 7 to almost 8% of the voucher renters in LA County. So very disproportionate now. And vouchers emerge from a long cross-program change in government thinking and government service provision, which I sort of hinted at the beginning of this talk. But we can sort of chart that or draw comparison across welfare and public housing, right? The sort of reform eras of the past several decades, right? Both programs have seen cuts to support, budget cuts and block grants and welfare. Public housing, you could draw the analogy to the demolitions in Hope 6, or also just the sort of freezing of budgets for things like repairing units and other things which sort of generate demolitions over time as well. As a result of those cuts, AFDC, or what's today now TANF, the sort of fraction of people who are in poverty who are receiving TANF has dropped precipitously over time. And a somewhat similar story can be told in public housing, where this dark black line here illustrates the decline in total number of public housing units over time. And you can see from the early 90s to 2011, the public housing program sees a decline of almost 500,000 total units, right? Which, given the size of families that might be living there, 2 or 3 people in a unit, I mean, we're talking about quite a lot of people, right? To some degree, that loss of units is made up for by the growth of other programs like the Section 8 housing voucher program. But of course, had those units been repaired and kept in good shape, there would be ultimately more housing in total today, perhaps responding to our housing crisis that we're in now. Secondly, both programs experienced a sort of devolution or atomization of sorts, where the way that the program, or the way that aid is administered, has been pushed down from sort of the government down into the tax code in a way, or is experienced at a sort of personal level, one by one, rather than in a sort of constituency, right? You know, if I'm getting the earned income tax credit, I'm getting it through the tax code, I'm not going to a welfare office, and I wouldn't know anybody else necessarily who might have the EITC, right? In the same way, this devolution of housing assistance from public housing, a physical structure that one can identify and know who's a part of, down to vouchers means that I don't know who else might have a voucher, for example, and I can't then create like a constituency to sort of advocate for some kind of change in the program that I might want, or something along those lines, right? So it's very much atomized the program, and I think that has had a sort of political or community organizing effects as well. Yeah.
Wondering how you think about that intersecting with destigmatization?
Yeah, so I think one of the arguments for vouchers or for going from traditional public housing to mixed income programs was that it would reduce stigma. But there's some work by Robert Chaskin at University of Chicago on stigma within mixed income developments, where the private renters in a development will essentially look down upon and socially isolate the renters who are in there who are getting public benefits to be in there. And I think there's a similar sort of stigma around Section 8 that also plays out, although it's not as, I guess you could say, precise. In my fieldwork, which I'll talk, I wasn't planning on talking about this, but you'd have kids in schools being called, oh, like you're a Section 8 kid, right? And it's just a racial assertion, like based on skin color, not actually any knowledge about the program. But I think what it illustrates is that the stigma around housing support or public housing is still there, regardless of how the program ended up being formulated. It just worked in a different pathway, basically. And finally, you see criminalization that sort of operates in very similar ways across these programs, right? Barriers to accessing the program based on criminal record, increased police and regulatory power over these programs, and increased penalties for violations, right? That would be losing your benefits on TANF, or on the housing side, that would be eviction. So let me just say a little bit about the methods I use to sort of investigate these issues in the Antelope Valley. So for the larger book project, I've done about 93 interviews in the Antelope Valley between 2011 and 2019. About half of those are with Section 8 housing choice voucher holders. Not being able to sort of go door to door and find voucher holders very easily, I just set up a table at the Housing Authority and interviewed people who are willing to talk to me there. And you can imagine that there's certain selection issues that might go on there in terms of who would feel comfortable speaking or not. And then the other half are sort of made up of local residents, private homeowners or private renters. And those are people who I met through door knocking in neighborhoods that the city of Lancaster identified as having high rates of voucher usage. There are also, I think, some selection issues there in terms of people perhaps not being willing to talk because they didn't see me as a member of the community or part of the neighborhood. And then since doing that work, I've sort of added interviews with local activists, lawyers, city officials, housing inspectors to try to flesh out the story a little bit more. So here's what I find. One, voucher tenants pretty much uniformly did not seek out the Antelope Valley, right? They are the opposite of the sort of moving to opportunity expectations. No tenants reported wanting to move to the Antelope Valley like ahead of time before their move, but most of the reason why is because they knew somebody else who had already made that move who could help them figure it out, or they went to the Housing Authority office and were given a list of landlords who would definitely take them. And they had this sort of time crunch in terms of how quickly you have to find your landlord and get the lease going before you lose your voucher. So these pressures essentially push them to the Antelope Valley, even though it's not quite where they ever had in mind. Some people had never even heard of it before they essentially had to move there within a month or two. It's not to say people didn't end up liking it. It does have a lot of its own charm, but I wouldn't say there was a lot of choice involved in this movement. Secondly, local residents did not sort of socially accept voucher tenants, right? Overall, I found that only about 14% of local residents were welcoming to voucher tenants, and about 2/3 expressed some serious form of hostility towards voucher tenants or the voucher program at large.
How are these measured?
I just coded interviews. Yeah. And this picture on the right here is of a LA County Board of Supervisors meeting where local residents came to protest the voucher program and asked the Board of Supervisors to basically stop the voucher program from sending its residents up to the Antelope Valley. Yeah.
How do you divide local residents? Because the demographic trends so much in the past decades.
I just mean they're like anybody who's living in the Antelope Valley who is not using the voucher program. Yeah. So the local government essentially tried to turn these attitudes into public policy. And I think they shared these attitudes as well. And they tried all kinds of different things. They tried breaking away from LA County to make their own jurisdiction that they thought could then not have to accept people coming over across the jurisdiction, but that was incredibly expensive, and so they dropped it pretty much right off the bat. They tried, and this is during a period of time where this type of policy was sort of in favor in California. They tried issuing a rule where they could evict voucher tenants if the children of those tenants were truant at school. It turns out that required some state legislation in order to empower, and they could not get that passed, so they didn't end up pursuing that pathway. They tried negative advertising, essentially trying to dissuade voucher renters from coming up to the Antelope Valley by telling them things like, it's far, okay, that's true. You need an air conditioner, okay, that's also true. But you know, there's no other group that they were actively trying to dissuade from moving there, right? They tried suing the county and the housing authority for sort of sending them so many voucher renters as a sort of burden or injury in and of itself. And basically none of this worked, and what they turned to was policing. And specifically a sort of participatory model of policing where the city would set up a sort of facially neutral set of rules that it knew were going to be enforced in a discriminatory manner. It's just that the way that they would be used was by private individuals. And so they could sort of continuously sort of keep their hands in the air and say, we're just enforcing these complaints that come in. You know, it's not us who's doing the discrimination. And so now here's where I sort of come back to the connection back to welfare, right? The system they set up really echoes the old policing of gender, family, and social relations way back in, you know, the early days of aid to families with dependent children, and what was called then the man in the house rules. And the man in the house rules, I'll just describe them. I'll call them the old man in the house rules and juxtapose what I will show you as the new man in the house rules. But these old ones essentially stipulated that AFDC was only in the business of supporting single mothers with children, right? And so if there was a father in the house or even, you know, a boyfriend or something, AFDC wasn't going to be providing financial support to that family, right? But of course, the only way to actually enforce that rule is to have your eyes on those families to know that the mother is indeed single, essentially continuously, right? And in this documentary, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, which does a really good job of sort of showing the fate of public housing in the U.S., it's a great, you know, teaching tool. You sort of see how this plays out. A former resident named Jacqueline Williams describes her experience moving in. She says, before we moved into Pruitt-Igoe, the welfare department came to our home. They talked with my mother about moving into the housing project, but the stipulation was that my father could not be with us. They would put us into the housing project only if he left the state. Mother and father discussed it, and they decided that it was best for the 12 children for the father to leave the home, and that's how we got into the projects, right? So the program is essentially mandating a sort of family separation, right? And the enforcement side is described by sociologist Joyce Ladner a little bit later in the documentary. She says there was even a night staff of men who worked for the welfare department whose job was to go to the homes of welfare recipients, and they searched to find if there was a man in the home. Sometimes men came back at night to be with their families. Some were found in closets hiding, right? So very painful realities of families trying to stay together, parents trying to see their children, but trying to do so in a way that didn't jeopardize their ability to receive basic sort of housing and cash assistance, right? Well, essentially, the same thing has played out today in the housing voucher program, despite the fact that in 1968, the Supreme Court sort of struck down the man in the house rules through its King versus Smith ruling, one of the like major accomplishments of the welfare rights and welfare sort of litigation era. And so this is going to be the story of how that plays out. So first, just to frame this out a little bit, the mayor of Lancaster, one of the main cities up there, essentially in a city council meeting openly explained what was going on. The city wants to limit the number of Section 8 units that are placed in this community. It's a problem that's crushing the community. It's time to go to war, right? He later instructed city officials to look into a means for making it very easy for neighbors to file nuisance lawsuits with the assistance of the city against Section 8 housing, right? And here, I think it's really important to point out that this is basically one type of government going to war against another type of government, right? Help the city sue a federal aid program, right? And so one of the first things they did was pass a nuisance ordinance. And it defined nuisance as anything which is injurious to health, indecent, offensive to the senses, and obstruction to the free use of property, so as to interfere with the comfortable enjoyment of life or property by an entire community or neighborhood, or by any considerable number of persons, right? an extremely broad set of categories that you could use to basically determine that anyone in this room is a nuisance right now, right? But the kicker is that 5 of these complaints would then trigger a penalty against the landlord, either a large financial penalty in the thousands of dollars or the possible confiscation of that property from the landlord, right? But the landlord's escape clause was that if they simply evicted the tenant who was living there at the time, they basically set the clock back to 0 in terms of these complaints, right? And so here you see a very simple but effective pathway by which someone can pick up the phone and file lots of complaints about their neighbor until eventually the landlord is forced to evict them. And I should also add that nowhere in these rules does it say that the complaints actually have to have merit to them. The second thing that they did was they created a sort of policing partnership. So the cities of the Antelope Valley partnered with the Housing Authority and the County Sheriff's Department to share data, collaborate on investigations of tenants, and create and respond to a fraud hotline. Most damningly, the Housing Authority turned over to the cities and the Sheriff's Department the names and addresses of Section 8 tenants who could then be specifically cracked down upon. And this generated, especially the fraud hotline, generated inspections that would then be able to evict tenants for violations of the basic voucher rules around you can't have an unauthorized tenant, or there can't be drugs in the home, or no one could have committed a crime, etc. Right? And so what happens during this era of this policing partnership is that you see a huge number of fraud hotline calls coming in just in the Antelope Valley, right? Almost as many as the rest of LA County combined, and more proposed terminations of voucher renters in the Antelope Valley than the rest of LA combined, which is really skewed given how small the Antelope Valley otherwise is. And what was happening on a sort of at the ground level, I think, is captured by this conversation I had with a local resident named Jim. And from here on, some of these quotes get a little difficult to hear, but I'll go through them anyways. Jim says, "When we got RX Paris in office, that was the change-up time. He stood up to the mongrels. He stands up for what he believes. He's against Section 8 himself, and bottom line is he's got the Sheriff's Department working with him where I got a deputy sheriff on speed dial on my phone. I call him every time I've got a problem on the block. I don't put up with no crap." Right? So he's clearly empowered in this way. And I asked him, well, how do you know who is Section 8 and who isn't? And he says, how do I know? First place, I know every owner of every house on this block, and I've got their number. And when someone rents a house and moves in, I ask them, okay, you ask the renter, or I ask the owner, is this Section 8 or are you just renting it out? And you can always go to the courthouse and find out if it's a Section 8 rental or not, because the cities had also mandated that every rental property file a business license with the city government that could be looked up. And Jim then says, I got the Section 8 people thrown out because I was calling code enforcement every day. Every day code enforcement was over at that Section 8 house, right? So he's pretty much explaining how he did it, right? And the effects of this type of policing, where local residents, like individuals, neighbors, are participating in the policing of their other neighbors, is felt in the lives of voucher tenants. And I'll just share some stories from 4 of these voucher tenants to show you what that looks like. And I think it'll become clear how they reproduce this man-in-the-house style regulation of family, romantic life, and so on. So Jasmine, she's going to describe how these searches of her home recoded her home life and personal relationships into sort of evidence of fraud. She says, and they'd come in there and raid your house, and he's going to say, how have you been living like this? Like you're out living out of a magazine. Because I had everything so neatly and clean. And what am I supposed to do? Have stuff all over the house? Then that would have been a problem. Because now, oh, the new thing is your house can't be dirty. If your house is dirty, I think 2 or 3 times you lose your voucher, right? So she's caught between this catch-22 of, if the apartment looks too clean, this will raise the suspicion that perhaps actually you're doing pretty well, you're actually well off, maybe you don't actually need the voucher and you're sort of scamming the government this way. But if your house is too dirty, well, you're then harming the landlord by disrespecting the property or damaging the property, and you could lose your voucher that way. She goes on to talk about sort of personal relationships and a friend named Michelle. She said, when Michelle told me what they did to her, Inspector Brody going to say that you can't have designer bags. So I'm dating a guy, and he brought me a designer bag. That's my business. I say, yeah, I'm not going to go trade it in. Come on now, that's stupid. Any purse a woman gets, any woman he done one out with, she get a bag. Last year, a year from last, and it's a designer bag. Guess what? She's going to continue to use it. Why would she just throw it away? That's stupid, right? What she's describing here is that if someone gives you a nice gift, it can count against you as evidence that maybe you are able to afford such a nice gift, and therefore maybe you don't actually need Section 8 rental assistance, right? And so a gift from a romantic partner or family member or something like this becomes a liability and makes people consider maybe selling it or getting rid of it or giving it away or something along these lines, right? The next person I want to focus on is Barbara, who fears being evicted for having a quote-unquote unauthorized tenant. And she'll also describe why her sister lost her voucher because her daughter had violated the crime-free rules. So Barbara says, I just moved here. I still get mail from the previous tenant. So that previous tenant, I had no control over them not changing their address. So therefore, when the tenant stuff comes in my mailbox, I just put it return to sender. Because if they catch anyone else's address and they're not on their voucher, they'll terminate you, right? So if you envision here, Barbara in her apartment and an inspection happens without her knowledge, right, her foreknowledge, and they look in the mailbox and they find a piece of mail with somebody else's name on it, that is sort of like strike one evidence of, oh, there's somebody else who's living here who's not authorized to live here, right? Even if that's a pretty facetious or like, not that probable issue, right? People commonly get mail that's misaddressed. All they really need is an excuse to get the process started, right? And so she says, I'm afraid, if I have family visiting and the inspectors decide they want to come over, they might see a family member's toothbrush or a family member's car, and the whole assumption will go into, oh, you have an unauthorized tenant, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? They just pick at that. So, I follow the rules. I don't want them kind of problems, right? So even here, having family over, right, if there's a second toothbrush, in the bathroom, this is thought of as a liability. And you can see how much people have to calculate what they're allowed to do with their lives to avoid the possibility of eviction. Finally, she says, when I first moved up here, they came to my house and brought the housing authority with them because they were saying that a man lived in my house. Well, a man don't live in my house. I'm actually a lesbian. So yes, that's my stuff. And so my owner had to tell them, yeah, she's a lesbian. This is her appearance when she came to me, right? So someone had probably put in a complaint saying, oh, there's like men's clothing in this house, so therefore there must be an unauthorized tenant living here, right? Maybe boots or shoes or a jacket or something like this. And Barbara, has to basically prove that these are her clothes, right? And she has to have the owner of the property sort of vouch for her. And finally, she describes what happens to her sister. She says, like my sister, she lost her Section 8 voucher. Her daughter was 13 and got into some trouble for shoplifting. So they were telling her, well, you can't have her here because she's on probation. You can't have her here because of this. She's on gang files and da-da-da-da. She said, well, what am I supposed to do with my 13-year-old daughter, right? Here, this is the way that the sort of crime-free rules in Section 8 housing really pit, families against each other in a way, or turn family members into liabilities that are impossible to solve for parents. The next person I want to talk about a little bit is Keisha, whose sister is surveilled for an unauthorized tenant who is her boyfriend. So she's describing her sister. She had a boyfriend. Her boyfriend had a separate apartment where he paid rent. He had a lease and everything. So they had a car sitting in front of her house for 2 weeks watching her house. And it got to the point where my sister and her boyfriend were like, hey, I don't live here. This is my lease right here. If you want, you could follow me to my house. This is my girl, like I spend the night here, but this is my girlfriend's house, trying to make it clear to the person who was sort of surveilling the home that, he had his own lease, but that, sometimes as couples do, someone will spend the night at the other person's home, right? But again, a romantic relationship gets turned into a possible reason to be evicted. And finally, Andrea tells the experience of a housing inspection itself. So when the man knocked at the door, I could see his badge. And I'm like, why are you here? I have a re-inspection tomorrow. I was expecting him, but the next day. He goes, oh, you've been selected for a compliance check. And I said, why are all these police here? My heart was beating so fast, it was about to burst out of my chest. He said, they're with me. And I said, well, you can come in. I don't have nothing to hide. But they can't come in. They don't have a warrant, and they're not coming in here. He told me, if they don't come in, then you're going to lose your Section 8. They go where I go. And I said, well, why do you need all these people just for me? It's nothing but me and the kids here. Well, that's up to us to figure out, right? Sort of hinting at this is a pretextual investigation. We're coming here to look for something that will then be a reason to essentially evict you, right? And she goes on to say, they came in with shotguns, they came in vests, they came in riot gear, And they held guns on us like we were wanted criminals. They surrounded my house. They did a massive search on my house. They went in my drawers. They held guns on my kids. They went in my kitchen drawers, in my son's drawer. They pulled out an ID and some money and said, bam. Threw it across the table at me and said, ha, who's this, right? As if they had caught evidence that some unauthorized tenant was living there, right? That's what the officer said. Yeah, we got her. Who's this? And I said, that's my son. He's on my contract, and that's a little bit of change from his Walmart job. And he said, oh, yeah, she's right. It turns out the son was on the lease, right? And so now you can sort of draw the comparison in the way that personal bonds are regulated historically between AFDC and today in the Section 8 voucher program, right? Then they were used to regulate the gender, sexuality, and family lives of tenants. Their surveillance was used to obviate any right to privacy. And these things were enforced through these sort of administrative raids carried out by a welfare office, for example. But in the housing voucher program, it's not just about regulating life, but it's also about turning those things into ways to evict people. Surveillance is not just having privacy consequences, but it's also creating sort of grist for complaints, things to file complaints about. And it's enforced not just by these administrative raids or by various elements of the government, but the raids are being triggered by the complaints of neighbors themselves. Right? And so what does all this have to do potentially with welfare rights? Right? And I think here, this is where I'm going to get a little bit sort of speculative, you could say, or maybe need your feedback in thinking the most. So before the welfare rights movement, this is what the sort of landscape of rights looked like in a really quick thumbnail sketch, right? AFDC recipients didn't have a right to travel, interstate travel. They had no right to privacy or personal autonomy, no right to due process, and people in public housing had no right to fair housing, right? And if we think of them together, tenants in public housing face the deprivations of those rights in AFDC as well, right? It's just that I think the way we think of them is categorized this way, but people floated between these programs and experienced these rights across the programs too. Well, thanks to welfare rights litigation, a lot of these issues were tackled, right? Shapiro versus Thompson in 1969 says that if you move between states, you are still eligible for their same benefits in the next state. King versus Smith strikes down the man in the house rules, which creates some modicum of rights to privacy and personal autonomy. Goldberg versus Kelly establishes a right to due process. And the Gautreaux case very famously establishes, at the very least, a right not to be segregated, you could say. Right? And again, public housing was a key site at which those rights were enjoyed, right, as the sort of Pruitt-Igoe documentary illustrates. But all of these, right, across both the sort of history of welfare rights litigation in AFDC and public housing, these are all threatened by voucher policing, right? And so this is how tenants fight back, right? After a while, tenants sort of reported these inspections and evictions to a local community group called the Community Action League, or TCAL, which then begins organizing, holding like town halls, protests, and connecting plaintiffs with LA-based legal aid groups. TCAL files this lawsuit called the Community Action League et al. Versus City of Lancaster and City of Palmdale et al. In 2011. And their suit is eventually joined by the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and it becomes the sort of first fair housing lawsuit that situates policing practices as potentially violative of fair housing, right? And as a result of this work, the main policing program, that partnership that I had described earlier, is halted in 2012. And it takes a few more years, but the settlement that comes out of this case ends it permanently in 2015. And as a result of this settlement, inspectors are no longer empowered to enter homes at all hours. They're not empowered to bring police with them whenever they feel like it. The data sharing that was going on between agencies that really violated people's sort of privacy rights was ended. The city was not allowed to hire inspectors with the sole purpose, basically, of chasing down voucher renters. And sheriffs could not ask individuals about their voucher status in the course of their other sheriff's duties, basically. In total, the fraud investigations that were going on from the Housing Authority dropped from about 600 in 2008 to about 60 per year between 2012 and 2018. So a real massive drop there. These are just some photos from the period of litigation that was going on. And so, I think tenants fought against this new iteration of AFDC's man-the-house rules with a lot of success. They diminished government power to police renters. They diminish the ability of neighbors to weaponize housing authority or other types of city rules. They bolster tenants' privacy rights and their ability to live meaningful personal lives. Right? But there are definitely some steps or distance yet to go. Right? So first, that case was settled, so it didn't establish legal precedent that can be relied on. Second, most of the litigation focused on that city policing partnership and didn't really tackle nuisance ordinance and municipal code enforcement, which is a major pathway to eviction. In fact, like one of the really important pieces on these ordinances, crime-free ordinances, is in an IRP newsletter from a couple years ago by Catherine Ramsey. But other tenant movements in Illinois, Minnesota, Ohio are making gains on this issue of nuisance ordinance and municipal code enforcement. So there is some, there's a pathway that sort of comes from this. And ultimately, sort of wonder why all this matters. I sort of come out of this work trying to rethink how we understand public housing and its legacy, and thinking about how important it is to sort of see its fate and trajectory alongside the trajectories of other social safety net programs, not just AFDC, TANF, but also Medicaid and other programs, more cohesively. And I think that the regulation of these programs really illustrates their similarities in a much more meaningful way than the differences between them. So I'm quite sure I've gone over time, so I think I'll leave it there and open it up for questions. Yes.
I have two questions kind of about the kind of enforcement regime you were describing.
Mm-hmm.
The first is that you reminded me, you had that picture of shattered bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about how in this like hyper-policing child welfare environment, you have like moms like weaponizing CPS to like settle disputes between each other, like call CPS from their friends. So wondering if you did that had happened at all in the code enforcement thing. And the second thing is like inspectors are there for like inspecting like plumbing and making sure your hot water is connected right. So how do they end up doing this? And how do you recruit people?
Yeah. Okay. So the second question is maybe the easiest to answer. First off, because I didn't explain a picture in here, so let me go back. And it's these guys. So the city, it's part of their policing partnership. They basically got money from the county board of supervisors and put in some money themselves to hire specifically investigators who were sort of based out of the housing authority to go after these tenants. And this is after they're basically stopped from doing their work. The city still gives them these certificates of excellence for evicting people, which was quite awful that happened. If you're thinking about sort of like how like maybe tenants weaponized the local housing authority against each other, I didn't see any of that happening. But I think perhaps the most important reason is because voucher tenants simply didn't know each other very much. So everyone who I spoke to was essentially experiencing this like pretty much close to alone, or their only other story was about another family member at best. So no, I didn't see that very much of that. Yeah. Uh-huh.
So I'm thinking about how landlords reacted to this policy. So I mean, obviously there's a big hassle in the recipient's lives, I mean in the renter's life, but there's also a big hassle for the landlords. Was there fight back from the landlords on this policies, or was it just there's so much demand for this housing that they sort of figure, well, these people are gone, that the next one will come through?
So I think the second is true, but it's mostly my speculation because although I tried to interview landlords, I didn't have very much success with it. So I don't quite know, but I do think they're sort of caught between a sort of rock and a hard place, right? Now you have to register, you have to get a business license from the city and sort of report your activity to the city, right? You have all these like increasing policies. You might be termed a nuisance property if there's too many of these complaints. These are really encroaching on these people's sort of property and business rights in a way that I'm sure that they were quite upset about. But on the other hand, I think all of those policies also served as a set of ends that I think the sort of the polity of the Antelope Valley was very much in favor of. So they could sort of have these cross-cutting pressures where it is more burdensome, but it's burdensome towards an end that they might have in some ways supported. But I don't really know with any empirical data an answer to that question. Mhm.
Do you mind speaking a little bit on why you struggle to get interview data from the 801 landlords? Because that does seem like an important part of this picture. Because you're absolutely right. There are competing forces where you have both their ability to regularly fill these households, but then at the same time, this growing nuisance and this growing difficulty with people.
Yeah, so after finishing most of these interviews by like 2019, the next step would have been to interview landlords. And what I did was I went to like the main websites where Section 8 rentals are advertised, like Go Section 8 basically, and just tried calling these landlords, but I didn't really get very much response in terms of interest in doing interviews. And the pandemic hit, and I just haven't really gotten back to it basically.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Did they have one of their reason? Was there just not an interest?
The couple that I had spoken to really saw themselves as like sort of doing like a public service in a way, like uplifting and taking care of these tenants and doing something that they should be praised for. So, they saw their work as somewhere in between like a business and sort of like a charity, but yeah, I don't know much beyond that.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense of how common these types of this approach is? Is it like very specific to this location, or are these tactics other communities use?
So pretty much in this same time period, the city of Antioch, which is like the Antelope Valley of the Bay Area, enacted the same type of policies in response to low-income residents being pushed out of San Francisco into sort of like the fringes of the Bay Area region. And there was a similar lawsuit there, but it was not successful to the same degree this one was. So I think housing authorities, are kind of enmeshed in some of this stuff. I don't think I've ever seen anything as bad as this case. But that's just in terms of like what housing authorities do. I think what really concerns me that is similar from this case to things going on around the country are the sort of crime-free and nuisance housing ordinances that lead to evictions. And there is stuff going on I think it's going on all around the country, but there's litigation recently in Bedford, Ohio, Peoria, Illinois, Faribault, Minnesota, and at least one other place whose name escapes me, that are all kind of challenging the sort of like racial segregation implications of creating these crime-free and nuisance ordinances and sort of weaponizing or enforcing them essentially entirely on one group of people. So that, I think that's like perhaps the most nationally concerning element that is seen here. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry if this is a basic question, and perhaps it is to a professor of law, but why does a settlement not establish precedence? And also, like, why did they settle? It seems like there's plenty of evidence to not need to settle.
Okay, so a settlement essentially says, and I'm not a professor of law, just the department is,
Okay.
it goes on. But I can't give you any legal advice or anything like that. But a settlement essentially says, like, we agree that we're going to drop this case with the following stipulations. If the city agrees to do this, if the housing authority agrees to do that, then we will not pursue this case any further, basically. And all those agreements were essentially many of the things that these tenants had been asking for. So that's what the settlement essentially was. Why they chose it, it's an interesting question. I think that they really did not feel strongly that it was like a slam dunk, not because the facts are not there. The facts are like pretty damning, but because no one's ever really tested whether a court could see like a policing practice as a fair housing violation, because it would really open the door to a whole new area of fair housing jurisprudence that really hasn't been tested yet. And so I think they, if they could basically stop the worst practice from happening right here in the Antelope Valley versus taking that risk, they chose to be, to play it safe, I think. And actually, like in the Peoria case around nuisance and crime-free housing, they also chose to settle. So I don't think there's actually been a case that has gone to a court and been actually tried that would establish precedent one way or another. Yeah.
talk about this in the context of litigation, which connects it to welfare reform, but are there tenants movements that are trying to get like these stipulation agreements enshrined in municipal or state law? Or are they focusing mostly on the litigation strategy?
I think so far it has been a sort of defensive litigation strategy, like only suing once your sort of back is up against the wall. I would, some of this stuff has sort of trickled into what I guess you would describe as like tenant associations and sort of like progressive advocacy groups like housing agendas that are starting to name some of this stuff, but that's a long way from actually passing anything. But yeah.
California could just prohibit housing authorities from sharing data with sheriff's departments.
Yeah. It could, and I think that would actually do a tremendous amount of good. I think it's just a question of getting it into the sort of policy pipeline, perhaps.
So is there what's the federal law? I
Yeah,
know
that's what I was
for
gonna say.
welfare, you can get a list of people on welfare if you receive TANF. Someone can ask for a list of people receiving TANF. So is there like a federal,
FOIA.
yeah, like can you, like, is that public information? Like the welfare rules are
No,
like public?
I don't believe so. No.
But I was just thinking, like, can you legislate federal, right? Like, it's not just, because the PHAs are federal, right?
Right, you could have a federal law prohibiting PHAs from.
Right, but I don't know if you can have a state law that tells the feds what to do. I'm not a lawyer, so don't listen to me either, but I can see how that might
PHA
work.
is a local, it's a state-created entity that administers a federal program.
Oh,
But it's a
okay.
state-created entity.
Okay.
I saw a hand in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to commend you for doing a really great job on describing the context around your research issue. I thought you did a really excellent job.
Oh, thank you.
And then I wanted to ask, so you had a lot of data, a lot of interviews. How did you go through and determine your themes and codes? Did you, and if you used the welfare rights framework, can you describe a little bit more about what that was and how you used it?
So I started by interviewing these tenants about their social experiences, and my original interest when I was a graduate student was in looking deeper into the sort of MTO framework, the moving to opportunity framework, right? Give somebody a voucher, they can move somewhere else that might be better off, and that will translate, presto changeo into their socioeconomic mobility as well, right? And I went to go interview these tenants to ask them what their social experiences were. And what I was interested in was like, well, if your neighbors essentially don't accept you socially, can you translate moving to a nicer neighborhood into nicer economic conditions? But they just kept saying, like, I feel like I'm being watched, I feel like I'm being surveilled, I've had all these interactions with police and inspectors. And so they kind of just told me where to go, basically. Those original interests are still sort of part of the work, but just sort of following where the interviews went, took it in this direction of like policing turned out to be a major part of the story, basically. The sort of trying to come back around to the sort of broader question of the welfare state is sort of my own reflections today about like where we are and sort of what we're doing in a way. When the way I was trained, or I think this is quite common in the way that like American social sciences work, is that you do housing, or you do this program, or you do that program, or whatever. And so, for example, like most of my education on vouchers as a policy comes from the world of housing. And it wasn't until several years after I began that education did I realize or learn that vouchers were like the preeminent tool used to undermine the civil rights, the Brown versus Board of Education case, right? And thinking about it in that sense of like a tool that was sort of like originally sort of developed or used to thwart civil rights, within 10 years being turned around and portrayed as a sort of champion of civil rights, really puts it in a different light, right? And sort of to go back and look at what people who, for example, in the very famous Gautreaux case, that sort of ushered in vouchers or sort of vouchers as a policy solution, whether or not they reflected on this, on this reality that vouchers had different ends in different policy contexts, I don't know if that's the case, right? I think maybe it's a very convoluted answer I'm giving you, but I think looking at these programs more holistically, within the social safety net overall or the broader welfare state overall, however you want to put it, I think can give us a different set of perspectives to understanding what's happening in housing. And I think overall that has been beneficial to my thinking, even if I can't articulate it very coherently. Mhm.
So your work kind of demonstrates how you see in other areas of anti-poverty and low-income support and stuff that every layer of devolution adds a layer of discrimination and racism. And when you have the programs that touch all these little private actors as well, it ties back into this current problem, as far as I can tell, in sort of the way law touches values and policy, where you have this trend of taking the government actors out of the equation, like with this thing with Texas and the reproductive rights thing. And so there's no accountability. And so the courts is like you said, there's this whole new area. And I think that also goes into this problem with the postage stamp communities that we've seen. And when you look at that housing ordinance map of Illinois with this ring around Chicago, and there's dozens and dozens of dots, and then the city of Chicago itself doesn't have one. It's a large thing. So the reason I mention all these different parallel issues to tie into one is that that it's it's the way that different areas of devolution can allow different unaccountable actors to basically promote discrimination to make what these guys with beard guy and senator wants, right? So and I say this because like you were saying, it's kind of a completely new avenue of litigation that is, I think, in a particularly challenging area, because I think you see some of these big decisions have an institutional interpretation of what's allowed to do is that you can do anything that's not specifically prescribed.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing that says you can't have your neighbors call code enforcement on you. So I just see this gaping maw of problem that I don't see how the judiciary would resolve that in any context.
Yeah, I think you've made the connection that's in the back of my mind, and I think in the back of a lot of people's minds, that to sort of borrow from Cheryl Harris, right? That you could see policing as property here, right? The old community, the Antelope Valley, didn't want integration, right? It was a perfectly segregated place up until 1962, basically, right? And unable to reverse segregation or integration, what they were given instead was policing. And that policing has these sort of social status aspects to it, right? They're sort of the wages of policing. If you have the power to police your neighbor and they don't have the power to police you, you are elevated above them in a way that is meaningful and different, right? Not nonetheless to say, even if you act upon that, you're even more elevated in that sense, and through not only just elevating yourself, but also through diminishing the status of somebody else, right? And so turning policing into a sort of status or property or form of citizenship, I think, is a commonality, like with this Texas case that you described. And I think it's a very, important, dangerous, area of policy that we seem to be floating into slowly.
I have two questions. So the first is, again, not a housing person. I don't understand the motivations of the PHA, right? So on the one hand, they're sending people to Antelope, and they're administering this federal grant, but then why are they also involved in the collusion with the policing? That seems confusing to me.
I think they just got strong-armed into it. I don't think that they had very strong opinions or feelings one way or another, but I think and this was at the local office of the LA County Housing Authority, its local station out in the Antelope Valley. So they're disconnected from the rest of the city to a great degree. I'm not sure that they knew what they were doing was, potentially illegal or what. I think they just got strong-armed into it and just, because the minute that it hit the courts, they just backed out immediately and were
So
like,
you don't think that they were driving it or?
no, I think they just got pulled into it essentially.
But you did say that the county board had bought into this.
Yeah, they had.
So there was maybe pressure from above for them to.
But they don't answer to the county board, do they?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Especially in a small town.
No.
Yeah, okay,
You're
point
right,
taken.
you're right, you're right.
Yeah, but not. My other question, I had two, was about, so thinking about the policy experiment of COVID and the ban on evictions. Do you have any sense, and I know you haven't, I know it's an unfair question, but I'm just curious if you've been following or know anything about how that might have like gotten rid of policing, for example.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't think it's an unfair question. I think it's like an interesting provocation. Like I think the way many others have looked at this changes in policy temporarily around COVID as an opportunity to study what might be happening under different circumstances. I think for the voucher program that'd be very important. I think the work around Child Protective Services demonstrated that that there are other ways of running those programs that seem to work just as good or better without as much punitive aspect to it. And I think, it'd be worth trying to find out if the same was true for voucher tenants and public housing tenants at large during this period. Yeah.
So I think this is super interesting. One part that I'm trying to think through, and I'm getting a little tripped up in thinking through, so maybe you can help, is the case is very persuasive. Then I'm thinking about the larger framework that you're putting it in. And so this idea, right, that before the welfare rights movement, there were all these infringements, right? And that we're then seeing them reproduced here. So a lot of those infringements have a really long history, right? They weren't a response to some kind of change, like they're the Elizabethan poor laws,
Right.
in modern context. But then you're framing this case as sort of a response to demographic change, right? So it's racially motivated. And that seems like a sort of distinct underlying reason for the response compared to like, we always stigmatize and monitor poor people.
Right.
And so I don't have a coherent thought there. It just seems like those are sort of different policy stories, and I'm trying to think about how they sort of fit together.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you're right. I don't. It's not my ambition to like hammer this square peg into the round hole or whatever. That like what's happening in housing is welfare rights. But I think it is. I feel like making the connection or showing these connections is important. If only like just for myself, even to just think about the broader connections. Even if fundamentally the cases are different in ways that can't be reconciled without like, sort of treating them unfairly. And I think you're right that there are different sort of genesises for these policies in the two contexts. Yeah.
I don't think it means you have to like abandon one. Like I think the idea that this is an application of, basically man in the house rules in a new form, like that's an interesting idea. But thinking about like, do people turn to those techniques at times when they're sort of under threat from outsiders, right? So are those tools that people use? Just, I think continuing to develop and think through that
Right.
part of the framework
Yeah.
has potential. It's interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Kind of following up on that, do you know if these nuisance ordinances were used against renters that weren't Section 8 renters? Like, do you know?
Yeah, that's a good point. So local residents basically speak of Section 8 renters or voucher renters as just anybody who they see in the neighborhood who is non-white. And so a lot of the calls that they were making to the fraud hotlines were about people who are not actually these renters, so the calls get dismissed pretty much very quickly. But a lot of the other stuff, like the nuisance complaints and things like this, are harming people who are not on the program, who are just assumed to be because of this assumption, of this connection between race and the voucher program. Yeah.
All right. I want to thank everyone for coming and thank Rahim.
Yeah. Thank you.